Good morning. Welcome to this next panel. My name is Jens Jeppesen. I work for the Center for Democracy and Technology. We're a public interest group focused on technology and internet policy and digital rights. I'll be moderating together with Liana to my left here. And the title of the panel is Are We Under Surveillance? And I think it's fair to say that when we look at the broad trends in technology and society, there is more and more data, there's more and more information available about individuals, citizens and consumers. Our lives are increasingly digital. We leave digital traces when we use communications, storage services, when we communicate online, when we do commerce online, etc. Digital traces are left behind, they're collected and they're stored, and they're used for various purposes. Most of them not nefarious at all, most of them quite legitimate, whether commercial or public sector. But many have pointed out that there is a scenario where the increasing availability, the increasing collection and combination of data creates a scenario of almost unlimited surveillance of citizens. And I think most people would not want that scenario to become reality. People want to have the expectation that their communications are private, that their data is well protected, and that we choose with whom we share information. At the same time, open societies need to protect their citizens against the very real threats that we know exist, whether from terrorism or organized crime or other things. And so the security services, the law enforcement community needs to use technology and needs to access information and data that's available. And so there is a balance to be struck somewhere. What we've seen, I think, in Europe over the past few years is many countries, several countries, expanding their surveillance capabilities and introducing new powers for law enforcement and intelligence services. Just this week in the UK, the Parliament passed the Investigatory Powers Bill that creates new and quite broad powers that many people think are cause significant concerns for human rights and privacy. So there are many dilemmas and objectives to balance, and we heard in the previous panel people talking about the privacy versus security dilemma, and I think some people think that's a mischaracterization of it, but I think what is certain is that the solutions that are needed for societies to meet these challenges involve law and technology and policy. They involve government, civil society, and companies and the technical community. So I'm pleased that we have such a well-qualified panel and diverse panel to talk about these issues today. We want this, as always, to be an interactive session. Liana and I will moderate among our key participants, but we really want to encourage people to talk from the floor and to ask questions. We'll have a short round of opening remarks, and Liana will now introduce our key panelists here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jan. I will introduce our key participants. The first to the left to Jans Henrik is Jan Claesson, Director of Information Society and Action Against Crime, Directorate General of Human Rights and Rule of Law of the Council of Europe. This directorate carries out standard-setting, monitoring and cooperation activities on a wide variety of issues, including freedom of expression, data protection, internet governance, cybercrime, criminal law, fighting economic crime, corruption and money laundering, as well as action against drug trafficking and drug abuse. He is the author of several publications in the field of human rights and international relations. Next to him is Christian Bargren, director at the Brussels office of the Computer and Communications Industry Association. He leads CCIA's work on data flows, international trade and internet governance, and engagement with international institutions such as the Council of Europe, ITU, and the OECD. Next to him is Harry Halpin, a research scientist at INRIA and W3C, where he started the Web Cryptography Working Group and Web Authentication Working Group to standardize the use of encryption in web browsers. He is president of the LEAP encryption project, which he will tell about us. He received his PhD in informatics from the University of Edinburgh, and he enjoys studying web phenomena empirically, such as the development of consensus in collaborative tagging. Next to him is Gregory Mounier, Head of Outreach and Prevention at European Cybercrime Center. He has been with Europol in various roles since 2008 and researched with SWP, German Institute for International and Security Affairs, researcher with University of Reading. And next to him is our female participant and at this stage, Valentina Paliser, president at One World Platform, an organization that works on the intersection of women's rights and internet rights. She is an activist, feminist, writer, and blogger, currently serving as vice chair at the Global Civil Society Organization and Network Association for Progressive Communication and Akcija Građana in Bosnia and Herzegovina, based grassroots organization. She is an advocate of the feminist internet and also a founder for a first feminist alternative web portal in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And next to her is Sasha van Geffen, managing director at Greenhost, a Dutch web hosting company specialized in simple solutions for complex IT problems, as well as dedicated to provide a sustainable internet infrastructure and to protect digital rights. Sasha is a specialist in internet security and participant in the effort to build more secure systems. He is a co-author of Basic Internet Security, a manual for securing online communication, primarily intended for journalists. And myself, I'm Liana Galstian from ISOC Armenia chapter, a board member.
So I think we begin with Jan for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jens. Good morning, everyone. Many of you, I suppose, like myself, at least those of you who will have traveled through Brussels Airport on the way to this conference, will have paused a moment and spared a thought or a prayer for the victims of the terrorist attacks that took place there only so very recently. They're a stark reminder of the threat that exists and of the capacity of Daesh to strike. But Daesh cannot defeat us, cannot defeat democracies that respect the rule of law. There's a risk, though, that we defeat ourselves by lowering our standards. And that, we firmly believe at the Council of Europe, is a trap we should avoid. I will not repeat what the Secretary General said this morning in his speech and during the discussion. The standards we have, notably in the Cybercrime Convention and Convention 108 on data protection, are, as was also pointed out in the previous panel, a very good mix of sanctions, security, and safeguards, which we should keep. I would like to highlight, though, here on two, perhaps three issues, if I may, Jens. First of all, I was struck this morning by some comments that we shouldn't speak to security services; they should speak to us. They should speak to us. Shouldn't we really consider that in a democracy, us is everyone who defends human rights and the rule of law? That is civil society and state structures, and that they are the terrorists. Dear all, we're on the same side of the fence. The right to life is just as important as the right to freedom of expression. In a democracy, I'm speaking about democracies, but in a democracy, civil society, government structures should really work together. Incidentally, also with industry, as has become very clear in a number of cases, how important the cooperation of industry is in this, to make sure that the terrorists can't win. That would be really one of my first key messages, if I may say so, but really something I think it is very important to bear in mind. And then perhaps to focus on two issues in order also to respect the time. Mass surveillance, security have been mentioned, and the need to strike a balance. Perhaps we should also distinguish, on the one hand, between surveillance, the gathering of data, and specific investigations, the need to get concrete evidence, because there's often a confusion between these two. And I would like to take this opportunity for a moment to point out the differences. As regards mass surveillance, and as the Secretary General has said this morning, there is the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. There are clear standards that have to be respected. A legal basis, foreseeability, effective oversight, to name just a few. It is also clear that as regards the Brussels attacks and the previous Paris attacks, not to mention other terrorist incidents, information was available. It is not that information didn't exist or had to be gathered. It was just not exchanged, or at least not sufficiently exchanged. And that is a very big challenge. How to ensure that information that is available and that has been gathered in a democracy, one would expect legally, and in many cases, in fact, as regards Brussels and Paris, was because there were investigations underway, police investigations, that this information wasn't exchanged, should be exchanged, of course, while respecting standards for data protection, privacy, etc. But that should not stop us from doing so. So that is the surveillance, the data issue. Then it comes to electronic evidence. Now, as in the fields of cybercrime, which for the purposes of this now would comprise terrorism, much evidence, critically needed evidence, is electronic evidence. And more it is not stored on a hard disk anywhere, but it's stored in the cloud. And it is one of our big challenges to ensure that we can agree amongst ourselves, amongst democracies, how to enable us to access this evidence, critical for criminal investigations, critical in the fight against organized crime and terrorism, whilst respecting safeguards. Because, of course, with the cloud you have a variety of jurisdictions. It moves very quickly. The suspect may be in country A. His data may be in a server or he may put his data on a server which is owned by a US company, but is then placing it in some remote island. How can you get to this data? We speak a lot about rule of law, but in the cyber world, rule of law, to some extent, is almost an illusion. Only in a very small percentage of crimes committed in cyberspace are actually investigated, and even less are actually brought to justice. If ministers of justice and senior police officers had the same success rate in solving cybercrime as in ordinary crime, in ordinary crime as in cybercrime, that is to say that if ordinary murder, theft, etc. were only solved to that very small percentage, most of them would have to resign within hours, I think. So really we have a big challenge here. So to sum up, the us and the them, the data are available. Let's see how we can exchange them whilst respecting safeguards. And let us not confuse gathering of data with very specific requests for information in the framework of police investigations. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Jan. On to Christian.
Thank you very much. My name is Christian Bolgreen, and our association represents the major internet companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, eBay, Amazon. etc. BT, Samsung. For us, when we talk about technology and data-driven technologies, it's services and products that people use because it enhances their life. Whether that be smartphones, smart fridges, everything's smart these days, right? Or insulin pumps if you have diabetes. But it's services that people are coming physically closer and closer to us and closer to our life. And of course, as technology becomes sort of ingrained in our daily lives, our companies and our sector has a responsibility to uphold that trust that consumers put in us, in our services, which is a commitment we take very, very seriously. And of course, data privacy, data protection is a fundamental right in Europe and many countries, so it's a responsibility that we take extremely seriously. And of course, if you as a consumer if you don't like your communication app or something else, you can just easily switch to another one. So that's why, we want to also make sure that consumers trust and have certainty in the services that they use. But as has been mentioned earlier and just now, of course, it is a balance with other rights, including the right to security. And that is a very difficult discussion to be had. I want to just mention 4 challenges that we are facing our industry related to this balancing act. The first one relates to transparency. We want to be transparent to our consumers so they know under what circumstances and what type of circumstances that their data might be provided to law enforcement when they have sort of a legal order to do so. It was in the US, our sector fought with the US government to be able to provide this transparency. And now we have most of our members, I think all our members, provide transparency reports where consumers can see sort of the amount and the types of requests that have been approved or denied by companies. We hope in Europe there will be also maybe more transparency among European companies when it comes to these kind of requests. Also encryption, the second point. We see many governments are pushing back on the ability to provide end-to-end strong encryption. And I'm not going to use the word backdoor, but there is a pressure on companies that they provide access to this encryption. And of course, the rules that we decide in our Western democracies will be also legitimizing what's happening in less democratic third countries. So that's also maybe something we should consider. And then thirdly, many of the laws that law enforcement use, maybe not so much in Europe, but for instance, in the US are quite old. In the Californian case, I think one of the rules were like 100 years old, more like from 1911 or so. So, which is, and this was about getting access to an iPhone. So you have an iPhone and you have a law written more than 100 years ago. So maybe it's time to reform and update sort of outdated laws and also provide more transparency to users. And then finally, and I think you mentioned the same point here, is that in cyberspace, questions like jurisdiction become extremely difficult, and we understand that. We think there needs to be a discussion about how to make sure that law enforcement can actually do their work, but it should be in full respect, of course, for privacy and security. It should be, it has to be proportionate, it has to be necessary, etc. So we would welcome a discussion on that. And of course, there are a few international rules like MLA procedures between governments on cooperation. And of course, these procedures need to work and they need to be efficient. And it seems to not entirely always be the case today. So I'm just going to finish there just to sum up. For our consumers, transparency, privacy, security is extremely important, and it is extremely important for tech companies. We should look into encryption. We should reform outdated laws. And we should have governments solve their conflicts of privacy laws and make sure that they collaborate, but of course with the full protection for privacy and security. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. We move on to Harry.
Oh, sorry. How many mics? Okay, so the question of this panel is, from cybersecurity to terrorism, are we all under surveillance? And this is a very personal question for me. When I flew in to Schengen last week, I flew through Frankfurt, very large airport. I was stopped at the border, and the German, the German police said, sorry, we can't let you in. I said, oh, well, why? I'm a security expert. I fly in and out of lot. And the reason is that there's a mark on my passport, and the Germans are like, we have rules, but there's no explanation in the database. And I was like, oh, yes, this is a problem. And that eventually, after a bunch of phone calls, missing connecting flights and whatnot, I was led into Europe, where I work on cybersecurity and open source, open standards to basically make Europe and the entire internet more secure. But I want to just make a very simple point. What happened to me being put on a list without due process due to national security exceptions, because I've investigated this. We've put requests to data protection authorities, and they just, because of national security exceptions, they don't have to answer why you've been put on a list. They don't have to answer who they've been sharing data with, including sharing data with countries outside of Europe, which often have less of a rule of law, particularly as regards to human rights. And there is no way to ask for removal from such list. And this gray zone, this massive state of exception caused by hysteria over terrorism should, I think, be eliminated. I think we should eliminate national security exceptions to human rights. We should enforce data protection. And look, I understand terrorism is a threat. I was in Washington, D.C. when September 11th happened. My last talk on cybersecurity was canceled in Paris-Wheat because of the police raids to capture the people who were behind the Bataclan massacre. I personally helped track down pedophiles over the internet. But at the same point, when you have such a out-of-control system where there's databases being shared with personal information, and it all kind of disappears into a dark abyss that the rule of law and the light of justice cannot look into because of national security exceptions, this is ultimately a failure not just of intelligence, and not just of our legal frameworks, but a failure of the very fabric of the society that we've been trying to build. A society that is healthy, a society that's not afraid, a society that should essentially encourage free speech, should not be able to effectively use a vague to undefined word like terrorism and not maintain secret watch lists. We should be, I think we should just eliminate them. And if we don't do that, we risk very severe dangers in the future as we continue to have economic and ecological problems, which will lead, most likely, to more crime, to more social unrest. And now is the time to really solidify these kind of frameworks, both technical and political.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So I'm Gregory Mounier. I'm representing Europol, the law enforcement community. Very difficult to speak after you and such a powerful statement. As a private citizen, I also feel pretty sorry about this type of problems that you might be having at a border. On the other hand, I represent the law enforcement community, and I think it's important that I make the statement now. We're not intelligence services, we're not security services, we don't have access to bulk data. We operate in a very tightly regulated legal framework. We are, and our investigators, the ones that are working on a daily basis on cases, cybercrime, drug trafficking, terrorism as well, are working using very targeted technologies and targeting surveillance. So I'm not sure that my testimony on this panel is very relevant because we're not in contact with mass surveillance techniques. We're not in contact with bulk data storage. But on the one hand, you have this type of situations where indeed there is abuse of watch list and the system is not working properly, and as you say, national security argument might be using and being abused for other means. On the other hand of the scope, you have investigators that are working on serious cases that are lacking the technical tools and lacking the legal framework to actually do their work. And then I come back to what Jan was saying. There is a lack of harmonization in terms of regulations, in terms of lawful access to data. I think that we need to work on a fair, transparent, and proportionate legal framework that creates a level playing field, both for the industry, but also for the law enforcement community to request legally and lawfully certain type of information, such as subscriber data, easily. We need also to harmonize issues such as data retention. I mean, I know this is a very controversial topic in this type of community, but my work here and my role is also to speak on behalf of the grassroots investigators, and I want to tell you that the lack of harmonized legislations at European level on data retention is posing real problems for them. I'll give you an example. If we're working on a case with 6 different EU member states, targeting an organized crime group based in different member states, if we find out that the criminal infrastructure can be a server that is used as a command and control for a botnet, for instance, is based in one specific country where the data retention period is only 48 hours, we know that we won't get any information and we can close the case. And that's a real problem. What that also implies for us, Europol, is that we need to, as soon as we get information, we need to prioritize our operational activities according to the member states and the data retention periods. So which means that we're going to work on the information coming from one specific country instead of what the logic would like to, us analyzing the big picture and trying to target the high value targets. The other point I want to make is about encryption. Encryption is definitely an issue that you're very well aware of. We had high profile court case in the US and the whole discussion. For a grassroots investigator, encryption is really a problem. So we have surveyed our partners throughout Europe, and it comes out that more than 75% of the investigations, cybercrime investigations, are hindered by some sort of encryption. So it can be end-to-end encryptions, it can be full disk encryptions. We do support at Europol strong encryptions. We believe that it is an essential security tool in our digitalized democracies. It's actually a fundamental element, protecting human rights, freedom of speech, privacy, protecting the digital economy, protecting security. Military, law enforcement need strong encryption. And we're not for backdoors, we're not for any technical means that might be weakening the whole security on the internet for everyone, that's for sure. However, we have to accept the fact and to acknowledge the fact that encryption and anonymity brings substantial criminal opportunities for terrorists and criminals. So we need to have a grown-up discussion about it with the industry, with the academia, with the law enforcement, and as a mature democratic society, come up to a balanced solution. Some of that solution might be not breaking encryption, obviously, but maybe legislating around lawful access to data. We need evidence. We are investigators. We are police. We're operating in a very strict legal framework. We need proper evidence. So maybe it's good to have access to the information before it is encrypted. So that's the type of things we're trying to promote. And the last point I want to make, which is also related to something really problematic for investigators, is IPv6 is not coming fast enough. That might resonate a bit better with that community, but for us, and we are having the discussion since 2012 now, the use of carrier-grade NAT to mitigate the exhaustion of IPv4 has a very concrete impact on investigators. You don't need to use Tor to be anonymous online, I'm telling you. Just use your smartphone and connect to the internet. The police won't be able to find you, that's for sure. And that's really, when I speak to grassroots investigator again, one of the first things they come up with is, we need to get rid of that CGN technique, or we need to find a solution. So I think that's it in terms of time. I'll pass on the mic, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, so a note on this gender of mine, sitting here. I was thinking to define myself as a self-defined male, because the fact that I'm an outside female, it's your projection. But then no, I'm a self-defined female, and I think it's important that I'm here, and I hope that my content will prove that it's important that I'm here, because you will have plenty of women where there is literacy, empowerment, social issue, but when there is surveillance, terrorism, the big, tough issues, women are less relevant, because we are the diversity that doesn't matter. And I would like also to just say, are you able to identify a terrorist? How a terrorist look like? I was a potential terrorist because I didn't reach my destination in Washington, D.C., because I was going last year and this year 3 times in Erbil, which formally it's Iraq. And for US security, even if I'm holding an Italian passport, I'm a potential threat. So at the Frankfurt airport, the migration officer and US citizens decided that I couldn't embark, and I came back. Thanks that exists internet, so I could join and participate in the conference I was supposed to go and talk. And it was about safety of women's human rights defender overall. So this is about my gender, and this is about how a terrorist look like. Now, do we live in surveillance? Yes, of course. I come from Bosnia-Herzegovina. Macedonia, it's less than 2 billion inhabitants. 20,000 people were tapped by their government using the telecom, the public telecom. Now there is a big scandal. There is, people are on the street. It's a colorful revolution that was stopped, by the way, by the EU trying to talk with and siding with the power. So, still citizens on the street, surveillance happened. Why? They wanted just to hide that they killed a Protestant. And the killer was someone very important to the Prime Minister. Serbia, surveillance, yes indeed, backdoor in the telecoms. You can spy anywhere. Finn Fisher or hacking team. Those governments, they are poor, indebted, they live on monetary fund, but they pay for those people. Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's a chaos, it's a mess. Everyone spies on everyone. So yes, we live in surveillance, citizens live in surveillance. It's a minority report kind of state where we live in. This is together with fragile democracy. Maybe in this developed Asian democracy, you have a separation of state and institution. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, judiciary, it's nominated and chosen by political parties, the one in power. At the moment in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the powers, the political party are the same they were 20 years ago when the war started. So, tell me about who is really able to stop or to talk with whom. And then the chilling effect, if someone's spying on you, which kind of frame it's establishing? It's a mainstream, heteronormative. We have to look normal. So if you look diverse, different, you are dangerous for yourself. So people stop to say things, people think twice, people try to hide. Not to be anonymous, to hide. Last but not least, a paradox of individual safety. If I go as a woman to the police and saying that there is a porn revenge because I'm going through a divorce, and my ex hacked and just portrayed me as a prostitute, which I have nothing against. I think the sex workers have the right to work. But if you are a mother and the friends of your children decide to make fun of you, and then you risk your position, your work, the health of your own son and daughters, and you go and then the police tell to you, why a woman of your age is on Facebook? You should look about serious things. So the same cyber unit that have a direct line when it's about child pornography, the same special unit will do nothing when the safety of an individual is at risk. But the same police will knock on your door when in Bosnia-Herzegovina we protested to arrest minors that put on their Facebook some element that were saying we were at the protest. So it's interesting how the safety of individual is not the security of the state. Still, the security of the state is based on the sum of the individual safety that should be done. Thank you.
So I was introduced as the managing director of Greenhost, but I am here in my capacity as a member of the working group Working Group 1 of the Freedom Online Coalition, which is about an internet free and secure. One of the tasks that we fulfilled was to look for a more inclusive definition of cybersecurity, because it's a thing that rules debates everywhere, but it is pretty, there are a lot of different definitions, and mostly in debates, cybersecurity is always framed as protecting the interests of the state or maybe of very large economic structures, but not necessarily as the end user. And as such, it basically excludes a lot of security that is really important, especially if it's about human rights. So we came up with a definition of cybersecurity that is actually built on existing definitions from ISO standards and etc. that does include this end user, and as such also breaks the juxtaposition of security on one end and freedom or human rights on the other end. The definition reads as follows. Cybersecurity is the preservation through law, policy, technology and education of the availability, confidentiality and integrity of information and its underlying infrastructure, so as to enhance the security of persons both online and offline. And this availability, confidentiality and integrity are like well-defined constructs also in the ISO security standard. So as such, we hope to create a definition of cybersecurity that would resonate both with you here in the room, which I think most of you are probably not law enforcement and or working on cybersecurity issues directly, but are working for NGOs or on human rights issues and etc. And on the other hand, would also resonate with the technical community and with people within justice and other departments. And this is important because what we saw happening and what is still happening is that we can discuss this topic here in this panel and we can all like walk out, and it's great that we do have Europol on stage. But on the other end, as we saw yesterday, there were like 3 people who were in the realm of cybersecurity who raised their hands in the morning session. So these are very distinct communities. They go to different conferences, and most of all, they make their different like laws in. I mean, this is all framed in local laws, and these are the laws that have been or are put up right now, like the new intelligence acts in the UK, what is happening in Germany, what is happening in France and the Netherlands. These are the laws that actually rule what will be collected, what will be available to intelligence services, and etc. And we're not talking to those people, right? I mean, it's not. And this is something that has to change. We need to start this dialogue, and we should start it on an equal basis. And if we. The only way we are doing this dialogue now is saying, yes, well, you want to have this like draconical law, but human rights. And then people say, well, you know, national security. And then a line is drawn, and the line is always drawn more to like extra measures towards security, like more abilities for security services, and never towards the human rights part. So in that sense, we're always losing. So what we should do is actually say, no, you're not doing too much. You're doing not enough. You're doing not enough to protect me, to protect us, to protect society. Because if you take cybersecurity seriously, you should also protect the end user. And with it comes encryption, with it comes secure systems, with it also comes the responsibility to make sure that our cars can't be hacked in a way that we get a highway in 5 years that looks like a scene from Maximum Overdrive, which is a very bad 80s movie from Stephen King, where trucks and household appliances get alive. But with the Internet of Things, that becomes closer and closer. So my call is actually to stop using this kind of speech of security versus freedom, security versus human rights, but to talk about security as something that actually enables human rights and should enable human rights. And then we're talking about trade-offs between security and security. And then we're talking the same language, and then we can actually have the debate that we should have about what we want to do to be able to both protect the sex worker and jail the pedophile.
Okay, well, thank you, Sasha. That concludes our opening remarks from the key participants. I think we got a very broad range of perspectives and also some very interesting personal experiences that gives flavor to this discussion. So now is the time for questions and answers. So we have people in the room. We also have people in other locations, and they have the possibility to feed in questions via our remote moderator here. And I think we all have the first question here from this gentleman.
This work turned on? I don't know. Patrick Pennings.
Can we get?
No.
Doesn't it work?
Map maybe. Can we?
I'm Patrick Pennings, Council of Europe, the Department on Information Society. I've intervened before. What I wanted to say, especially also after Sasha's intervention at the end, my remark basically is we live in one society. And unfortunately, very often, what we look at is from very different communitarian perspectives to the same reality. And I'd like to come back to what Jan said at the very beginning. We have to, especially as an institution like the Council of Europe, we need to be able to look at society as a whole, from all those different perspectives. We have to be able to bring these different communities together. Since I'm also dealing with data protection and cybercrime and freedom of expression, what I often realize is that we are talking maybe in a multi-stakeholder perspective, but uniculturally. That is that we look at our realities from one single angle. And if we want to promote a real dialogue, that dialogue needs to involve everyone. And I've seen it in IGF, I've seen it in EuroDIG in the past. Certain communities are underrepresented. The law enforcement is underrepresented, let's face it. A second thing, we really need to make that distinction between the securitarian approach, where we constantly speak about the increased mass surveillance, and I think it is extremely important that we have a very close look at what that mass surveillance entails and what that means in our democratic societies. That's, by the way, why the Secretary General of the Council of Europe also proposed to start codifying these elements. At the same time, let's not forget that when it comes to international cooperation and European cooperation in particular, that will be the first item that national authorities will say, this stays with us. We do not want an international organization to start looking into. But please distinguish, and that was clearly indicated also, distinguish between mass surveillance and criminal investigation. And if we're mixing those two things constantly, then we point the finger to law enforcement who are doing their job in a democratic society to ensure that our internet is and remains a basis for societal dialogue, where we can protect the sources of journalists, where we can protect the whistleblowers. That is crucial. And that distinction, if we are not capable of making it, we will always mix the discussion between what is a securitarian approach, which is clearly promoted by the developments of the opponents to democracy on the one side, and what we need to do in order to protect a free, open space, which is the internet today. And it's not a question to anyone. I think everyone has brought a perspective into that, which is very important, but we need to look at it from a more global, complete societal aspect. And we try to do that in the Council of Europe, bringing together law enforcement officials and data protection officials. They also speak different languages. Freedom of expression activists and law enforcement. I think it's crucial that we need to continue doing that, and I think, as was the foreign minister of Latvia, of Estonia said this morning, if the EuroDIG in 2017 wants to focus on that, we have to ensure that law enforcement is also better represented in this type of dialogue. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Sorry, before you continue, does anybody want to come in on this remark?
So one quick comment. I agree that there's a difference between mass surveillance and targeted surveillance. Okay, so 2 points. One of which is Europe's behind. Targeted surveillance is, what put me on a watch list. Targeted surveillance can also go wrong. Targeted surveillance can actually, as Valentina pointed out, be targeted at what many people would think is the healthy functioning of a democratic society. It can be targeted at activists, it can be targeted at LGBT people. So it's not really, I think, you don't really want to say mass surveillance is bad, what the NSA does is bad, but targeted surveillance is good. It's actually should be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And what we're arguing is that the rule of law and human rights should also apply to targeted surveillance. You should not just enter this sort of nebulous gray zone when you use the word terrorism and then use targeted surveillance, over, for example, people like myself, security experts, climate change activists, whatever. This should be stopped. And the last little point I want to make is that mass surveillance, Europe's lost that game, right? Europe does not have the investment, the systematic investment that was put in. Well, it depends how you feel about Britain, by the U.S. And but they don't, I don't think, France has some investment, but they do not have the capacity of the NSA. So what you could do, if you really wanted to craft a European way forward, you could sort of say, if we followed Sasha's advice and created more secure, more rights respecting internet, within Europe, that's actually very attractive and an alternate path that actually is also probably better at preventing cyber attacks if you have more secure infrastructure. And mass surveillance, I don't really think it actually helps prevent crime. It seems to be mostly used for economic sabotage. I don't think it's actually used very much to stop terrorism or whatnot. I've seen very little evidence of that. It's very dangerous. I think the danger is that it could be used against people internally inside the country, and that's what the concern is. But we already know targeted surveillance, which does work in Europe, does this.
I see Christian has some remarks. You want to?
Yeah, if I may, I think it's a very important distinction between surveillance that you're talking about and law enforcement on the other hand. And I think it's important that we in Europe also realize that surveillance is also taking place in Europe. There are surveillance laws in a number of European countries. Many countries probably don't have laws, but just do it anyway. So I think it's important to have the discussion about surveillance in Europe. I think surveillance is a French word, right? So it can't all be American. But on the other side, when it comes to law enforcement, a crime has happened or is about to happen, and law enforcement, the police want to get access to that. I have a little bit of sympathy here because it used to be quite easy, Crime happened in Belgium, the Belgian police would take care of it, and the material was probably in the apartment, sort of physical material. Now that it's in cyberspace, and it's very difficult to understand what is the jurisdiction here. You can have a crime taking place here, the person, the criminal is in another country, but the data is stored in a third country. And it is very, very difficult I imagine, for countries how to make sense of this loss of jurisdiction in cyberspace. And there's different approaches. Some countries will try and just overreach and ask for the data regardless of where it's taking place. It's a very an internet sovereign approach. And I'm hoping that maybe here in Europe, maybe in the West, that we can sort of figure out a way to make sense of those procedures, so we can actually have transparent laws, transparent procedures, which respect security and privacy.
Thank you. Sasha?
So yeah, just to get back to the mass surveillance, I think the major problem of any kind of mass data collection is, in the end, you will be looking for a needle in a stack of needles. And in a way, if you have enough data, the only thing you will find is noise that looks like the data you want to have. And we've actually seen this with all of the recent, even terrorist attacks, where information was available, but it was not there at the right place at the right time. And this was not even collected through mass surveillance. But so managing information is, I think, one of the key issues of both intelligence services and police. And I wanted to dive into that a bit because, grassroots investigators and etc. were put to the front. I think there is an enormous lack of training and skills at base police and investigative levels if it comes to the internet and what you could do, and that is blocking a lot more of the current rate of solving crimes than anything else. Because if I get to the police and have to report a crime that happened online, it will take me my whole day to explain to the police officer what I'm actually reporting and why it is a crime.
We have a question from the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just for the record, my name is Elsa Saadeh and I'm from Lebanon. It's my first EuroDIG. And I thank every panelist for whatever you said, and I'm going to project back to the first speaker, and I'd like to thank you for the very touching start, and I would echo you and add all the victims of terrorism around the world, and not just in Brussels. And I'd just like to say that the word terrorism in and of itself around the world is used so differently. And since Europe is being a role model with its laws, with its courts, with its human rights, I think that you should be very careful when you develop laws and when you say that we should, let's say, define what is terrorism and how to deal with it. Because since it's the role model of the world in terms of human rights, Arab countries where I come from, and maybe even all around the world, it could be taken advantage of. In Saudi Arabia, a blogger is considered a terrorist. He's given 1,000 flogs as a charge, as a sentence, just because of a blog. So I think it's an ask, more than a question, that when you are considering laws, please do look at the world as you are a role model in Europe. That's pretty much it. Thank you.
It's a really excellent point. Thanks for making that. Did you want to come back on that? Do we have other questions? Do we have remote questions at the moment? But otherwise, excuse me, go ahead.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Lucy. I work for Access Now, and we're a digital rights advocacy and policy group. Now, first of all, I would like to say there are conferences where these people get together. Please, let's talk after. I was at Europol actually a couple of weeks ago at Privacy in the Digital Era, and it was and I think it's going to be maybe an annual conference, hopefully. I'm looking at Europol right now. But there are more of these forums emerging, and there is space for civil society to engage. So let's take advantage of this, and let's connect, and let's see what kind of an impact we have. There was also a Microsoft Cybersecurity Summit. There was a ton of civil society, academics, lawmakers. There was ENISA, Europol, the Commission, everyone in the room. So we have these platforms. I think now we just need to be more effective and engaging with them as civil society. Secondly, there's a question about lawful access and what it means to be a terrorist. Now, when I was 16, I moved to Kuwait because my parents were working there. And I was a bit of an alternative kid. And I was put under surveillance back then. I didn't know what it meant. I logged onto my computer and I was rerouted. Certain websites were blocked. I brought this up to my mom and she said, okay, maybe don't go online at home. And I didn't know what that meant back then. And then I said something a couple of months into my stay there, something very stupid. Like, I fucking hate religious people. I don't know, something, like a very strange teenage projection of angst at being in a different environment. And I was in quite a liberal country, but the Ministry of Interior actually interrogated my mother, who was also profiled because she was single, divorced since I was 3. And we, for them, were the risk factors in that community. We were the weird ones. I was a potential hazard because I was youth and I was angry and I didn't fit what they perceived to be normal. And my worry is that with what you perceive to be lawful and what you perceive to be normal in our society, and yes, in Europe we do enjoy a lot of human rights protections, we have courts and we have safeguards, I completely agree, and I want law enforcement to be able to do their job. I want intelligence to be able to do their job, but I want you to be profoundly aware that what is normal for us is not everyone's normal. And you can be completely ostracizing and shunning young people just like I was shunned in that society. That did nothing for my sense of self. It did nothing for my sense of identity in that community. I became more alienated and I questioned the world surrounding me even more. And second, I really like the Council of Europe point on the rule of online as an illusion. And I would just like to bring up in the Internet Referral Unit that currently runs under Europol, I think if you think rule of online is an illusion, you have only the legislators to blame, because more and more you're making rule of online an illusion. By relegating these powers that you should have as law enforcement to pursue illegal online content to platforms, and literally in the Europol regulation, when you read it, it states that illegal content will be referred and it will be left to the discretion of online platform facilitators to remove this content or not. You're making that step and you're making that rule of online an illusion. So my question to you is, how do you reconcile the goals that you have with what I just said? Thank you.
Very good points. Thank you. I think definitely Jan and Greg should come back on this one.
I agree with much what was said. I think it's slightly unfair to say it's just to blame the legislators. I think it is clear that the whole development of cloud computing and data, electronic data not being accessible cannot be blamed on the legislators. These are developments that have gone very fast. And let's also not be naive. Criminals and terrorists have used every opportunity these new technologies give them in order to operate better. It is certainly clear that we need to enable access to evidence in the framework of criminal investigations. And again, just if I may come back to what Harry said, and my colleague mentioned the difference between mass surveillance, and criminal investigations. That's not targeted surveillance, that's a criminal investigation. That's a proper criminal investigation, which happens to include electronic evidence, but which is just as a normal investigation as if you steal a bicycle and the police is investigating that, or a car theft. That's the evidence must be secured. We have to see, as I said, with industry together how we can make it possible for countries to have access to these data. The real issue is jurisdiction, as you rightly said. which laws apply where. You also mentioned MLAs. The average time span for an MLA request at the moment is 6 months. It is also clear that electronic evidence, there's no point in doing an MLA request because you simply won't get it, it won't be there anymore. So we're at the moment considering the possibility of two things: a protocol to the Budapest Convention and the Cybercrime Convention. That would be a common legal standard. One of the elements would be that states could allow, under certain circumstances and with safeguards, that their police, I'm speaking about the police here, not about the Secret Service, the police, law enforcement could directly make a request to a private company that hosts data elsewhere without having to go before going to its own judicial authorities, simply to enable that law enforcement to get the data before it disappears. So I think we're working on on issues, but I think it's a bit unfair to say it's only the fault of the legislator.
Thank you. There was a point about referral units at Europol.
Thank you. Maybe before making a comment on the Internet Referral Unit, I just want to make a point on this surveillance as well. So, targeted surveillance, surveillance is one of the tools in the toolbox of investigators. You need to have targeted surveillance tools. For instance, if you are working on an organized crime groups that is super security savvy, using Jabber server to communicate, you need to be able, over a certain period of time, to basically monitor what they're saying in order to actually build up your case and investigate. So targeted surveillance is a lawful instrument in the toolbox of criminal investigators. That's what I want to say. I'm glad in terms of law enforcement engagement with the internet community and the internet governance community. Thank you for raising the fact that we have organized that conference together with ENISA and IPA on encryptions and data protection. I think it was a success. We hope to do it again next year, and we invite the broader community to join, because that's also one of the platforms where we can have a proper dialogue on these very important issues. On the EU Internet Referral Unit, well, as a private citizen, I would definitely agree with you. I think that there is a trend towards maybe privatization of policing online, and that's probably not ideal. However, we need to be realistic. Over the last 2 years, we've been faced with very serious problems, something new, the abuse of something that we all enjoy, a social media platform by terrorists, to propagate terrorist propaganda, to call for terrorist act, and to circulate really awful images and things. Should we try to solve the jurisdiction problem, which is a very long-term perspective, and at the same time try to address something really pressing? I think that you need to be realistic, and I think that the compromise we found in the Europol regulations, and before that by establishing this Internet Referral Unit, it's answering a need. We're supporting the law enforcement authorities of the member states to get rid of that terrorist propaganda that is abusing our platforms. But yes, of course, at some point you need to find a realistic and short-term solution, and that solution was to rely on the terms and conditions of this social media platform. I know it's not the ideal solution, but in the short term, that was the only solution we could. I agree, we should push for something more holistic. We should have harmonized legislations, good MLATs, and so that we know which jurisdiction to turn to. But at the time of addressing that problems, that wasn't the case.
Yeah, I'd shortly like to reply on the fact that there are already some platforms to where this debate is actually taking place between security communities and civil society groups. I think there might be a few. There's a trend of some more, but it's still not so much. It's still very distinct, and especially the security communities are still doing a lot without consulting. And I think even the recent thing with the new things between Facebook and Twitter and the Commission is a great example of how things are going really the wrong way in how this is handled. And I really disagree with that kind of putting responsibility on the platforms, because that is a very deep chilling effect. to because it's removing the rule of law actually and leaving it to the kind of like whatever the platform wants, and that's really bad.
Yeah, you go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Marianne Franklin, Internet Rights and Principles Coalition. Thank you very much for making important distinctions between law enforcement, mass online surveillance and terrorism. These are three very different domains, even if they do overlap. However, the recent perpetrators in the last few years in Europe have been well known to the authorities, correct me if I'm wrong, and they often advertise what they're doing on Facebook. So the assumption that this stuff is happening always through encrypted means, I think I would like to address that. But my real question is this. What forms of recourse, legal recourse for individual citizens or groups who find themselves being subjected to disproportionate forms of border control, the awful experiences our American colleague had? I have this pretty much every time I cross the border. Our borders are being turned into brutalizing, dehumanizing moments of access and exit. So what does an ordinary person do if they feel they have been inappropriately treated, incorrectly treated, put on lists they shouldn't be on? Where does an ordinary citizen go? Should one go immediately to the European Court of Human Rights? I mean, this is a huge leap upwards. I was wondering if you could respond to some practical measures for the rest of us. Where can we go if we think wrong has been done to us? We have been inappropriately treated. I feel this part of the conversation really needs addressing at this point. There are bad people out there, we know that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Marianne. A very relevant question. And of course, what happened to Harry, what happened to you, it shouldn't happen. When the Secretary General mentioned the Court of Human Rights, governments are supposed to implement the decisions. They're also supposed to follow the case law. In the recent year, if you were to look up, and you can easily find it on our site, the case law of the European Court of Human Rights in cases such as Harry, such as yours, violations have been found. There were actually individuals who took the trouble, and I am the first one to agree that it is a long and complicated process to actually get there, but a number of people did, and they won. These cases now have established firm principles which our governments are supposed to uphold, and please keep reminding them. That's of course also where we need the help of civil society to make sure that these decisions are known, that these principles, it's not so much a decision, but the principles and decisions are known by lawmakers, by your national parliaments, by your authorities, and refer to them.
Thank you, Jan. Did you want to
Yes,
comment on that?
I would like to go back to spaces and to access. Because if you really, I mean, we always talk about the importance of civil society to be in this place. But to be in this place is incredibly expensive. And activists, they do not only work their activism, they sometimes do other things to survive. So time, money. So if you want to have access, if you want really to have those people, the people at the conversation, then we need to have them probably at the national level. But this is access, it means real access, knowledge, because people need to be able to participate and not just be impeded to participate because they don't know what is IPv6, because no one spends that time because they think the usual citizen cannot think, because this is the reality. And also about platforms. Yes, there are platforms, mainly in English. So if you want really to have a global participation, if really it's a global, why a person needed to be very, very fluent in another language and never can use her or his or their languages? And also the experts. So I think that we really, if we want to make, not to just have a blah blah of participation, if we really want to have the people, the citizens, the user, the customer, the ones that suffer the terrorism, because again, victims are individuals, then I think that we really needed to talk about access. Because security, cybersecurity, surveillance, terrorism, I know by experience how people feel minusculous and not ready to talk about this big issue. But it's our life, and we are expert in our life, and it's about the so-called expert, legislator, tech company, they have to talk. In my reality, I know that a big company will sit with the government without tender getting the specification of how they're going to survive or protect the people. No one called me to be there, to be part of the design. So I think we need a meaningful participation, not to have a tokenism of people, of civil society, to legitimize what the elected individual forget that they are elected, chosen by the people, servant, public servant.
Thank you, Valentina. I also support that point regarding the language. Sometimes people forget that not everyone in the world are English language carriers. So, thank you.
So I would just like to make a point on the recourse. What do you do? And it's actually it's very interesting. So with my case, which didn't happen in Kuwait, I was living in the UK, doing climate change activism, which is now celebrated in Paris, but at the time was viewed as fringe and possibly dangerous, and was targeted by essentially a law enforcement operation who was just gathering intelligence, and I almost feel bad for the poor German border guards because they don't know why the British put this thing on my passport, and I don't really even know why, and so it's it's confusing that this data gets shipped around and whatnot, and the problem is that I'm a white guy, decently wealthy. I've got security clearances. I work in cybersecurity, right? So, I can afford a lawyer. I have a solicitor. We're going after the case. But this is where I just really want to bring up the national security exceptions and back to what Elsa said over terrorism. The problem is I say, well, look, I would like to know how to get off this list. It would be nice. I have to travel for work. It's at least irritating. And when you ask the British police authorities for information, it's a bit complicated, but I've done it, and they just won't give it to you. They'll give you some. They'll give you some, maybe a parking violation or whatnot. But everything else, which we actually have well documented, it's an exceedingly well documented case, the British surveillance of the climate movements, primarily because one of the undercovers, started seducing activists, and the UN. It's a terrible story. Even though it's well documented, we have photos, we have court papers. The police won't hand over any of that for someone to say, hey, I would like to get off this list because that would violate whatever national security exemption they were running the whole crazy operation under. And this is why I actually think the real solution to this problem is eliminating national security exceptions, and also, to be honest, eliminating the use of the word terrorism. I was in Paris, I was in DC. So that's murder, right? So people get murdered. That's very different from blogging, and that's very different from, nonviolent civil disobedience, very different from marching, right? So these are all, very different from, pedophilia is very different from a parking ticket. I mean, criminal, terrorist, these are such vague terms that when you use them, as an engineer, I revolt. You lose track of the precise nature of what you're doing and all sense of proportionality. And that's the real problem with the entire legal framework that's sort of being crafted here. And I do think that Europe is doing a better job than most other places by a long shot. That being said, we have to really fix it. And I think that if we can't fix it legally, we will have to fix it technically. And that someone like myself, I am going through the proper legal recourse because I'm very privileged, but so many other people who are poor, who are immigrants, who are, Muslim being targeted. And then, what actually happens, I think, when people feel like they have no recourse and they're being targeted for their beliefs, being targeted as potential terrorists, is then, as you've seen in France, they become people who want to murder people. And this is the real problem. So I think that's what we need to stop.
Thank you. And
just a quick...
just for a moment, before you're speaking, I'd like to pay everyone's attention to the screen. We have our rapporteur's notes, and if you just have some disagreement with that, you can have a speech on that. So. Go on, please.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. I think the last the question from the floor was what are my redress opportunities as a citizen if I feel if I'm on a no-flight zone or some other maybe law enforcement database, maybe you have the same name as a terrorist, which is very unfortunate that you want to have that sort of clarified that you're not that person. You're innocent. You're good. So it's quite interesting in the U.S. There's actually quite a lot of debate about this. The Congress this spring passed a new act called the Judicial Redress Act. I know that because we were the first association to sort of lead those efforts to push for a year and a half to give that right, where European citizens, all 500 million European citizens, now have the right that they can take the US government to court, they can have clarified the data, and they have a redress procedure there. So these things are happening. There will also be a new ombudsperson function in the US, hopefully being approved this summer. So these are some mechanisms that are happening in the US thanks to a debate there. I'm not saying it's perfect. I mean, I'm just saying that there's a discussion and things are happening there. I think in Europe there's less of discussion. We're quite focusing on what's happening over there. But it's interesting that Americans don't always have those rights here in Europe, for instance.
Thank you, Christian. If there are no questions at this point, I wanted to see if we could just get a bit deeper into the encryption problem, because I think both Jan and Greg alluded to it, and Sasha mentioned it as well. So after the Apple FBI case, there was sort of an uneasy truce, it seems. But is there a perfect solution here where we can keep systems and devices and services protected, while at the same time law enforcement can get access when they feel that they need? I'm not sure. Actually, the ENISA Europol statement suggests that there isn't a perfect solution here. Do you have a perspective on this, Jan? I'll put you on the spot.
Very short.
Thank you for such an easy question when we're close to 1 o'clock. Fortunately, the FBI Apple case was an exception. We saw in most cases, or at least in very many cases, data that comes from a legitimate, not speaking about surveillance, but in a normal law enforcement procedure, a request for information is actually granted. And for instance, Apple makes these data, publicizes the data transparent. It indicates the number of requests it complies with. It's also interesting to note that the number of requests it complies with varies quite greatly from country to country. If I remember correctly, most requests are actually accepted in the United States, a large number from Europe, although then the percentages from European countries seem to vary a lot. So there is something definitely to be done. We should make sure that, and I come back to the us and them, that the ones that are laughing at this are the terrorists. That companies and governments can work out procedures that do respect human rights, that do respect the standards I've referred to, but that make it possible and again, I make this distinction, in the framework of a concrete criminal investigation into a specific case with proper judicial guarantees, that in such cases the evidence that is needed to successfully prosecute can be obtained.
Other views on this?
Just, I wonder, before the digital, before the encryption, how mass murderers were arrested. I would say that mass surveillance is the anti-intelligence, because it's cheap. You use a super algorithm that costs millions, or many algorithms, and then you harvesting. But you can use actual people, because if you have to follow or to target or to be alerted, I think that, so I think it's a cheap way. Less police, women or men, start to have this wonderful silver bullet that can, so how we were doing before. An encryption, I think this difficult word should be the rights of communicating with who I want, where I want, anytime. And again, why someone should break up front. So I would like to understand why we focus on encryption when we should focus on how make sure we use intelligence to protect the people properly, not get the shortcut of the super digital, which in one place bring everyone.
Yeah, just on encryption, I think it's extremely important for users, not just individuals who want to communicate freely, but also from companies who try to safeguard their corporate data from thieves and cyber criminals, etc. I think one quick solution is, of course, that governments should never be able to mandate backdoors or other vulnerabilities in companies' encryption. If you create one backdoor or one vulnerability, that will be used by other persons, other criminals, and other third countries. You have to have strong encryptions, no backdoors.
I think there's a lot of like folklore, like speak about how encryption thwarted any kind of like research and etc. if it comes into crimes. I think what actually thwarts most of these things is the lack of proper digital knowledge, as I said before, of like the people on the street who are doing this research. So these are like investigators that are like working on a local level. And that's where we can improve quite a lot. I mean, there's things you cannot do and that everybody's aware of. You can't like inject a probe in someone's brain to see what they think, so we can actually like and jail them for their thoughts. And we can also not break all encryption to collect evidence. But in the end, most of the crimes we're interested in and that are like most devastating for society are the things that in the end happen in the physical world. And that is also where most of the evidence comes from. So I think if you look at that and instead of, indeed, as said, focus on that encryption, focus on the kind of like techniques that that technology has brought law enforcement, like DNA techniques, like advanced scanning of crime scenes and etc., that are helping investigations. I think the trade-off for law enforcement is not that bad.
Just very briefly, I agree with most of what has been said so far, but you can't deny that there is a trend as well over the last 2-3 years for having cheaply and readily available encryption techniques. And so there is definitely a trend of criminals and people, bad actors, to use encryptions to hide their traces, to hide their financial transactions, to hide their communications. And in fact, the amount of evidence that used to be available for law enforcement outside encryptions is reducing. That's well documented, and that's true. It doesn't mean that we need to break encryptions, but again, we need to find smart ways of getting the information we need in order to investigate criminal cases without undermining the security of everyone. No, you're laughing, but it's so easy to take the one-side approach and say encryption is a binary question, there's no way around it, and that's it. Sorry, we're living in a real world with real crime, and you have a lot of law enforcement people that are really honestly trying to do a good job. And I'm speaking to colleagues every day, and they have in their office a pile of hard drive containing evidence, and they can't crack it. Okay, there is some cases that will never be closed, but this is true. This is just the evolution of our democracy, so we need to find an alternative.
All right. I think we are unavoidably out of time. Is there a question over there?
Can I have a last statement, maybe?
Go for it quickly.
Hi, my name is Bernhard Heiden. I'm with the Young Pirates of Europe, but I'm also a computer science student. And I want to get a little bit into the technical discussion because it's important to understand it, I think. So most people, when they think about encryption and like breaking encryption, they see a computer and it's blinking and everything is scrolling and blah, 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 blah. This is not how it happens, actually. It is very silent. You do not know when a 0-day, for example, is used to infiltrate and to like actually see what is encrypted. And so I don't notice when I'm getting hacked by other people. And you will also not notice when you're getting hacked by other people most of the time. And so I don't know if the loophole that I'm keeping open for law enforcement will not be used by other people that won't be nice to me if we assume for a second that law enforcement will be nice for me, which is a premise that we can accept, but is not the case for most of the people on our planet, actually. So I think it is very important to stick to our principles here and to keep encryption. And that also has something to do with the availability of encryption. There will always be, for example, open source projects that will be behind encryption because it's important to have this kind of measures. And so there will always be technical solutions for people that actually want to have a private conversation over the internet. It's not a problem. And like, you will always have, like, you will never be able to solve the problem at all. So why will you jeopardize the privacy and the ability to have private conversations for all of the other people, for most of the people who just want to, like, I don't know, privately send their nude pics?
Thank you for that contribution. We are out of time. I think we should thank our key participants. I'm not sure we found solutions, but we covered a lot of ground. And you know, the remaining problems can be solved maybe over lunch.
That's a good point. Thank you very much. Meeting is adjourned.